Essentially, the Russian Revolution was the first time a Marxist program had been applied. Marx and Engels had written a lot about the colonial question, and the left had taken that up. Why? Because the majority of humanity at that point lived in countries that were either colonies or neo-colonies. Lenin referred to that. We'll look at those numbers, but essentially the majority of humanity lived in what we could call the global South. And even though the notion of Marxism was that it would be the proletariat of the advanced countries that would shake off the chains of capitalism, etc., the reality was that there was this huge number of people who lived in either colonies or neo-colonies. Lenin picked up on that, and there was a debate in the Second International, 10 years before the Russian Revolution, at a conference in Stuttgart in Germany, where Lenin polemicized against the right wing of the Second International, who advocated, it's difficult to conceive of this, a socialist colonial policy. When the workers took power, how would they deal with the colonies? And Lenin said the way we should deal with the colonies is to free them. But he also said, and this is a quote, the British bourgeoisie derives more profit from the tens and hundreds of millions of inhabitants of India and other colonies than from the British workers. And therefore there is a material and economic basis for infecting the proletariat with colonial chauvinism. And this referred to the notion that far from being in solidarity with the global South, the workers of the Socialist International thought that they were superior, racially superior, culturally superior, economically superior, etc. And this was something that Lenin and the left wing of the International, including Rosa Luxemburg, broke with. And he returned to this idea a number of times, stressing how the European workers needed to unite with the workers and peasants of the colonies against the European bourgeoisie. And this was somewhat abstract until Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the left wing came to power in Russia. Now you had people with very strange ideas, very unorthodox ideas, very, very extreme, bizarre ideas. All of a sudden, we're controlling a state. And with a state comes a certain degree of power. And after the seizure of power, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were in a position to apply their ideas, and they did. First thing they did was ended the Russian domination of the colonies and applied their policy of self-determination up to and including succession. The second was a series of measures that a state can undertake formally on the diplomatic front with Afghanistan, with Persia, later with Turkey. And third was the application of their policy by the Communist International. And this really began with the Second World Congress of the Communist International in July of 1920. It was a key debate. There were documents prepared, they were adopted, and they called for the liberation of all the colonies and neo-colonies. Lenin spent much of his limited time, his health was failing, on the commission, and he made the point, and the document made the point, that the world was divided between a very few oppressor nations and many oppressed nations. Lenin, who was a very practical politician, did the math in his report. He said 70% of the world lived in colonies and neo-colonies, and therefore making common cause with the oppressed of these nations and offering material aid for their liberation could create a viable alliance that would bring the majority of humanity to the side of socialist revolution. And that they implemented. Shortly after the Second Comintern Congress, they held a Congress specifically around this issue at Baku, the Congress of the Toilers of the East in 1920. Delegates came from all over, mainly Central Asia, to Baku in what is today Azerbaijan. hundreds of delegates. Zinoviev made the keynote speech and called, in language that today we would say is somewhat provocative, for a jihad against imperialism. And when you read the minutes of the end of his speech, it's quite impressive. Comrades, brothers, the time has now come when you can set about organizing a true people's holy war against the robbers and oppressors. The Communist International turns today to the peoples of the East and says to them, brothers, we summon you to a jihad in the first place against British imperialism. And the minutes say, tumultuous applause, prolonged shouts of hurrah, members of the Congress stand up, brandishing their weapons. The speaker is unable to continue for some time. All the delegates stand up and applaud, shouts of, we swear it. Now, the fact was that this was not just the speech, radical, rabble-rousing speech of some kind of radical. This was a representative of the government of a country that occupied 1/6 of the Earth's surface, calling on the masses of the global South to rise up and declare a holy war against imperialism. So this was quite a policy. They began to implement this. One of the things that they did was establish the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. Not something that many of you are members of the Alumni Association of, but when you read who went there, it's very impressive. Khalid Bakdash, secretary of the Syrian Communist Party from 1936 to 1995. Chiang Ching-kuo, president of the Republic of China, was in the 1925 class. His classmate, Deng Xiaoping, who would later become the paramount leader of the People's Republic of China. Nazim Hikmet, the Turkish poet. Ho Chi Minh was a student and later on the faculty of the University of the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. M.N. Roy, who co-authored the policy on the national question with Lenin, and on and on. Members of different minorities, different colonial things. Sbalawani Shwala, leader of the Young Communist League of South Africa and a revolutionary writer. First, Tran Phu, first Secretary General of the Communist Party of Vietnam. This goes on and on at this university. It was a university that trained revolutionaries to go to their countries, particularly in the global South, and make trouble. And many of them did. They set up the Whampoa Military Academy in China, in Guangdong. And there, Hank Sneevliet, a leading member of the Comintern from the global South, who'd been in Indonesia, trained revolutionary cadre for the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang. The International Red Aid, set up in 1922. The International Workers' Relief. A number of organizations, specific organizations that dealt with the global South. In Germany, Willy Munzenberger, close associate of Lenin, set up the Hands Off China campaign in 1925 to build solidarity with European workers against Chinese workers. Then they set up, a year later, the Against the Cruelties in Syria Committee to mobilize people against the French attacks on the Syrian national liberation movement that eventually led to an independent Syria. They declared solidarity with the Abyssinians, as the Ethiopians were known in the 1930s. And there were boycotts organized all over the world of Italian goods, including in Vancouver, pickets of the Italian consulate, etc. This was at a time when the Western world essentially turned its back on any of these liberation struggles and in fact supported colonialism. One of the people who was involved in this was a man by the name of Sukarno. Another one was Nehru. Another one was Kenyatta. Many of what would be future leaders of colonies that had freed themselves were part of this. Many of them went to the Brussels Conference of 1927, which launched the Anti-Imperialist League, which built solidarity around the world. It had a Latin American component that was involved in the Hands-Off Nicaragua campaign in solidarity with General Sandino, the Free Maya campaign in solidarity with Julio Antonio Maya, leader of the Cuban Communist Party. That these things existed. They set the foundation, if you like. They established a tradition that would later be implemented around Vietnam, around a series of other solidarity movement with Venezuela today, etc. After the war, the youth festivals took over and brought together young people from around the world, and this is where a great deal of solidarity activity was inspired in the 40s and 50s. In 1955 was the Bandung Conference. The Bandung Conference is important because it was the first time that the newly freed colonies of Indonesia, Vietnam, etc., were able to come together. And this is kind of the origins of what became called the Third Way. Neither an endorsation of revolutionary communism, but also not an endorsation of capitalism. And that was directly linked to the Bandung Conference. In the speech that Sukarno gave, and Bandung is in Indonesia, he recalled that many people first came together in Brussels in 1927, when they were a kind of hodgepodge of disaffected intellectuals, left nationalists, etc., who were beginning to build movements, and that now, 20-some, 30 years later, in fact, they came there representing their countries that had thrown off the shackles of colonialism. So many of these leaders had cut their teeth in organizations that were organized and spawned by the Russian Revolution. And that's something to understand the impact that the South African leadership throughout the colonies had gotten their experience. After the war, the Chinese Revolution, which had been in part fostered with aid from the Soviet Union, won and opened up something far more dramatic. In Malaysia, there was an uprising that was defeated. The Philippines, another one that was defeated. But in Vietnam, they defeated the French and then went on once again in the tradition of freeing themselves from colonial domination in inflicting the first and only to date military defeat of American imperialism at the hands of a former colony. None of this is separate from the tradition of the Russian Revolution, despite some of the deformities and the terrible fate that befell the Russian Revolution. And that went on with the war in Algeria, with the war in Kenya, and reached a height in the Western Hemisphere with the Tricontinental Conference and the launching of an organization called OSPAO, the Organization of Solidarity of the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, sponsored by the Cubans. And today that continues, places like Venezuela, that Nino's going to talk about. So that when we look at the impact 100 years after the Russian Revolution, of the revolution in the global South, we can see that despite its failure to spread socialism throughout the world, it certainly played a major role in doing what Lenin hoped it would at the very minimum, which is liberate the majority of humanity from the domination of colonialism and neo-colonialism, despite all its flaws, failures, etc. So it's certainly a history worth studying, and I'm going to stop there.